Something major is happening in VCT Pacific that is not happening in EMEA or Americas, and that's concerning if you're EMEA and Americas, because those teams might be trolling. To understand this, we are going to talk about a topic that I have talked about in the past, but something has drastically changed, and the Pacific teams seem to be taking advantage of it, but the EMEA and Americas teams, as far as we know, are not. First off, let's explain the idea. The idea is very simple. It's having more than 5 people on your roster. In fact, it's having 10 people on your roster. And this is something that if you know the Valorant history, you'll know that EG did this in 2023. And you might also remember that that little team called EG, they just so happened to win champs that season, being the only team to use this strategy. And the thing that's really crazy about EG is that they did something that really no one else has ever done in Valorant. Because when you looked at EG's team at the start of the season, this was a team of a bunch of kind of misfits, people who hadn't really done anything in Tier 1. You had Ethan, who had a name in Counter-Strike, but hadn't done too much in Valorant. You had Jogmo, Com, and Boostio, who, were kind of always on the fringes of Tier 1, but many people before this season might not have even considered these 3 Tier 1 players. And then you had BCJ, who was EG's kind of most notable player in Valorant and had some success with Xset, and he was kind of seen as their kind of star player. Now, many of you will know that BCJ actually eventually got benched for Demon 1, of course, and Demon 1 came in instead. And the thing is, a lot of people at the time, including myself, the reaction was, why are you benching BCJ? He's your best player. Now, of course, in hindsight, that looks ridiculous because, of course, we know that EG won champs. And I think a lot of people in their minds think that, EG got good because Demon 1 came in and Demon 1 was really good. But that's not really how that season played out for EG, because if you take a look at what actually happened in their results, let's start here at Lock-In down at the bottom. They managed to beat Team Heretics, one of the worst teams of that season, of course, and then play Talon, who also weren't very good in that season, and lost to Talon. So in Lock-In, not a great start. They then lost to Cloud9, and Demon 1 actually made his debut in this game against 100 Thieves, where they also lost 2-0. They then did manage to beat Crew, who didn't win a single game that entire season, by the way, so keep that in mind, before then losing to Furia and getting 13-0'd by Loud here on Pearl. And the thing is, a lot of people I think have blanked out their mind. This was with Demon 1. This was with the team that won champs. They lost 13-0, not BCJ. Now, things did start to get a little bit better for EG as they then went on a bit of a winning streak and ultimately did make it to Masters Tokyo, of course, requiring 100 Thieves to lose in the kind of most mad fashion of all time. But then they didn't win Americas. It's not like they were dominating here, right? They lost to NRG here in the regular season, and then they did manage to make it to Tokyo, but then quickly lost to Loud and NRG again. So at this point, they had improved, they were good, but they still weren't world beaters. They were still losing to the better Americas teams like Loud and NRG. But then this, to me, is where EG actually significantly leveled up, was the gap between Masters Tokyo and this America's lower bracket final. Because now you see, they just go on a run of winning 2-0, 2-0, 2-0, 2-0, even against Loud, a team that beat them in the playoffs just before. So this, to me, is where EG really came into their own, only then losing to Fnatic, beating Paper X, and of course then losing to Fnatic in the grand final, but still finishing second in the world. Then, of course, they went on to champs, and as we know, they would go on to win champs. And as I was saying, EG are the only team to really do this, where they significantly improved during a season. And some of you in your minds are probably going, well, what about teams like Team Heretics or GenG, who came out of nowhere this prior season? Well, if you think about it, Team Heretics and GenG, those kind of surprise teams that no one maybe expected to be that good this year, well, they were just good from the start of the season, right? Both of those teams made it to the first Masters. Both of those teams were just good throughout. I mean, Team Heretics kept changing their roster throughout the season, and they were still really good. They just recruited really well and just had a very good team that people just were sleeping on, essentially. It wasn't like EG, who actually started out pretty bad and weren't playing that well, and then still managed to become champions in the same year. The thing is, you don't have to take my word for it that the 10-man roster was crucial to EG's success. You can take Potter's word for it.
We just kind of go over what we want to see out of the reserve roster, what comps we want to see on what maps, and then we do a lot of drills versus whatever setup that we want to see. There was a lot of gaps for us at champs. So having the tool, having the reserve roster has been really beneficial for us this year.
And so there, Potter is talking about running drills with the 10-man roster, but now let's take a look at some other examples of pros explaining a day on a team without a 10-man roster.
Usually it's Sunday to Thursday was the normal practice schedule, unless like a LAN was coming up or something. Then we played 6 days a week for like, it was like server time for 2 hours, and then 4 or 5 scrims. So that's like 6-7 hours, and then we reviewed after, so that's 8 hours.
I'm looking at how much we have to practice. So basically our practice starts at 10 and ends at kinda at 9. So it starts 10 a.m. and ends at 9 p.m.
And that's the thing as well. Those teams are spending so much time so inefficiently, it hurts me. Because just think about it, right? Let's say that you have a weakness on defending the Ascent B site, right? Whenever an exec comes towards you, you aren't doing well on Ascent B site. Well, let's take an hour session, right? You could play either a scrim or you could run drills. Let's say if you run a drill, it takes a minute to do a B exec every single time and reset it and do it again, right? That means you can run 60 B execs in a row if you want to in that hour session. In a scrim against another team, they might run a B exec a couple times, 2-3 times. Maybe sometimes they're on an eco, maybe sometimes you're on an eco, so it's not like the full practice that you really want. So you're talking about 60 reps versus maybe 2. What do you think is the more efficient practice? But I've been through all of this before about the EG 10-man roster and all of that, and actually at the time it made sense that it was only EG that did it, and then the fact that EG didn't carry on with it as well. And the reason that that made sense was because it cost a lot of money. Because guess what? You had to pay 5 other players who weren't playing for your main team. You had to pay them the tier 1 minimum salary, which for Americas is $50,000 a season. So that's 5 people that you're paying at least that amount. They could have been paying them even more, I don't know. And I'm pretty sure they would have had to help out with their housing as well. So, the cost is really start to build up, and you have to wonder if it was worth it for those teams. And obviously, almost everyone decided no, and even EG, after winning champs, still decided that no, the cost was too much. And so that was always an excuse that teams could give as to why they weren't going to do that. But things have changed now, because Riot this past season announced that Academy teams would be allowed for the first time for the Tier 1 teams. Now, the reason that Academy teams weren't allowed before was that Riot was worried, how would Ascension work, essentially, with Academy teams? Obviously, you couldn't have a Tier 1 Academy team win Ascension and get promoted, and then, you'd end up with basically 2 of the same team in the league, and that would lead to, of course, all kinds of various problems that would lead to. But Riot decided that, hey, to help out with Tier 2, we're going to allow Academy teams and make the simple rule that Academy teams can't make it to Ascension, right? If they win their league or whatever, well, then just the second place team goes instead of the Academy team. And the Academy teams, of course, are a big deal because as far as I'm aware, and maybe I'm wrong about this because I don't know all of the rules fully 100%, but I would assume that the Academy team kind of, can skirt some of the rules of sort of, your Tier 1 team, i.e. you wouldn't have to pay them necessarily the minimum salary, you wouldn't have to find them housing, all of that kind of stuff. You could just sign them as a bunch of people, basically, have them play in Tier 2, but still help you with some of these scrims. And so in that sense, you can still get a lot of the same benefits of having a 10-man roster without having some of the negatives of the costs involved. And not only that, but of course this is good for Tier 2 as well, right? So many people complain about Tier 2 and how, there isn't enough money in Tier 2 and there's not enough, jobs and not enough teams willing to sign players. Well, this is a way, even if you're not making a ton of money from being on an Academy team, it's at least a way of making some money, right? You can make some money from playing in Tier 2 if you're on one of these Academy teams. And so that's great, right? That means more Tier 2 players, even if they can't necessarily win Ascension, more Tier 2 players are getting paid. So this is something that has potential major benefits for essentially everyone. And yet, something weird is going on, because if you take a look at this article, this was announced like a couple weeks ago. Below is a list of all the Pacific teams that will be fielding an Academy team in 2025, right? And you've got in Challengers Korea, DRX, GenG, T1, Zeta Division, DFM, RQ, Talent, Team Secret, Global Esports. 9 of the 10, partnered teams that aren't Ascension teams are having Academy teams, which is great. If you're wondering who the one is, it's Paper Rex. And if we look at EMEA and Americas, the only ones that I'm aware of are BBL have signed Pacific and MIBR have announced that they want an Academy team. as far as I'm aware, those are the only ones. Now, that's not to say they will be the only ones. It's possible they haven't announced it yet, right? And they will have academy teams. But if this carries on like this, what are teams doing in EMEA and Americas? Someone help explain this to me. If all of the Pacific teams can see that this is a good idea, what are the rest of you doing?